thank you for coming to here this evening. We come from an organisation called the National Working Group for Tackling Child Sexual Exploitation. We're a national group based in the Midlands, but we work across the UK and have contacts beyond there. This evening I'm going to focus, not that way, I'm not going to focus, am I? I want to focus on young people and the vulnerabilities of young people and some of the stories that young people have told us in the context of our society. There are those who say, you know, has this just happened? Is it something new? Well, it's not something new, but some of the messages that we picked up as professionals is one of the things that young people will tell us that is, if you don't ask me, I won't tell you. And so when young people aren't asked about what's happening in their life, they won't share it with adults. So they won't share it with health professionals, social workers, police, etc. They won't share it. It's not just some sort of distant thing. That actually, if you don't ask the questions that are worrying you, and sometimes we as professionals are afraid of asking questions. I know that later on the commentary will cover on some of these. A lot in the media about grooming. There's a particular model that appears in all of the media, and that's part of our conversation this evening, is sort of that inner city sort of grooming model that is often focused on Pakistani and Asian men, is a particular model of focusing on grooming. But there are many different ways in which young people are brought into child sexual exploitation. Some of it may be grooming, and some of it be in all parts of society, but there are also others, and it's not always an issue of kindness. Sometimes there's direct blackmail brought into it, etc. So there are other ways in which young people, it's not just girls. Vulnerable young boys as well are brought into the incident. That volume not reaching the bottom. Okay. In some ways it's a quote, a slightly different personality, but a quote that I think matches, which is Albert Einstein's quote, which is, "The world is in greater peril from those who tolerate or encourage evil than from those who actually commit it." Sometimes our focus as a society needs to turn on ourselves sometimes and look as a community about what we're actually doing. I believe there was a conversation, we've been so busy today I haven't actually heard the news, I'm usually a bit sensitive to news, but about further redundancies in Middlesbrough around public services and social care, etc. So public services are very diminished by the current economic crisis or the current political decisions. Therefore, it depends on us as communities, as communities providing services to our, looking after our own children, caring about our own children. That's what's important, that we actually have to work together. We can't just look to statutory services all the time. What happens, we had a presentation by a team from Yorkshire, a boxing team, who were talking about boxing, and there was a young boxing coach there who described what he said was, he says, once you open your eyes, once you actually look out, you actually see things. And he says, it's like I suddenly seen there was a sewer beneath my feet. He says, suddenly I realised that all sorts of things are happening on the street. Again, will be touched on by Alias later. All sorts of things that you can see happening. But sometimes we don't see, and if we don't choose to see it, we won't see it. Some other quotes by various people who I haven't listed here, but what's very clear is the figures already described tonight about the number of young people who've been exploited and who've been abused. We can't just prosecute our way out of it. That's not the only solution to this. You know, we can't throw everybody in prison. It has to be about some judgments about what we expect as a society. We have to work as communities that will keep all of our children safe. And we are talking about children. We are talking about young people, you know, under the age of 16, under the age of 18. They are still children. We're talking about children, and there are particular challenges for today's community. We have to look, but sometimes we can't look unless there's a lens. We have a couple of elephants in our presentation, and this is my favourite elephant. This is actually, and this is a real picture actually. This isn't a set picture. Well, it is a bit set because the gamekeeper knows what's going on. But in fact, what you've got is people who've spotted a rhinoceros 200 yards away. They're all very excited. They've got their cameras out, and they've kind of missed the sort of wildlife behind them when the elephant is looking over them. And in our communities, we're like that as well. We don't see something that's happening around us until somebody sometimes picks up and points out and says, turn your lens that way and have a look at what's going on here. So when we were working in cases like Operation Retrieve in Derby, which was the first major issue, it was very clear, lots of professionals were very worried about people, about young people. So yes, I was worried about them. But I didn't know what, almost I didn't know what to worry about. I didn't know what to do with those worries because it was not clear to me what that was like. Lots of people say about the young people, well, they made choices. They made their own choices. They consented to it. Sometimes they still attracted to the partners, etc. But was it a real choice? Was it a choice they understood? One thing that's happened in 20 years is that the age of puberty has almost dropped by 2 years. So people go through puberty younger. So they become part of a sense of growing up. At the same time, there's no growth in your neurological, biological build-up. So in fact, you're less prepared for dealing with that. So young people we often talk about the technology, but there's some of the technology about what the young people themselves have to bring to the table that can make them more vulnerable, can make them more vulnerable out in the streets. They're already experimenting with stuff. 2 minutes? Goodness, okay. Three. That's all. Loads then, I can slow down. So this is a picture of the different people that take this. Part of it is the grooming, part of it is what happens in the streets, but beside that, some people, financial gain, poor, they're more vulnerable because they themselves have needs, they're hungry, etc. The other is the peer pressure. Some of the issues that people worry about what's on the internet, what's all that, the peer pressure, the idea of what's normal and how do we get engaged. So groups of young people get involved and getting something that they perceive as normal and it becomes a normalised behaviour. But the one I bring today is both professional and societal behaviours also. We think it's normal for those children, for those young people. Those young people are different. They're young people who live different lives, as if they don't have the same hopes and plans as others. So therefore we think it's okay for them to be involved in sexual activity. And that happens in the medical profession and it happens in all sorts of different settings. So groups of people can take advantage of them, and that's sometimes in the settings that we're seeing, but sometimes that's about online issues as well. What we know about the young people that we've seen is that there are many different issues and there are many lists of issues, but when you look at this list, something strikes out, that the importance of family structure is really important, and where bad things have happened in the family, whether it's drug and alcohol, mental health problems, bereavement, or other types of loss, family adversity, domestic violence, the things that mean young people don't want to be in the house, they want to be somewhere else. So they're out there, and actually if they're not in the boxing gym, they are more vulnerable because they're out there and if they're not somewhere where they're held by adults, they're at high risk. And what do the young people tell us about the adults? What do they want from the adults? I've got health written on this because that's my speciality. But they're strangely simple things. Look interested. Tell us who you are. Make eye contact with me. Look up from your computer. Be friendly. So they're fairly obvious things. But actually, what they want to know is that you do what you do, and you do it with a passion for what you do. Whether you're a nurse, whether you're a youth worker, whether you're a man of religion. That they know who you are. That's what they will always say they find helpful, is those things, and to build a rapport with you. They're the critical elements from them. The relationships are key. And then also for us as professionals, the relationships are key. That we talk to each other. Do we develop relationships with the youth workers, with those in the sports centres, with those in the churches, the temples, the imam, develop relationships so we know who people are, so that we actually can all share in concerns. I'll just quickly run through these 2 slides. These are what we see as being risk areas around young people. What we see, revolving doors, young people coming for repeated sexual transmitted infections. People are asking for tests are particularly worrying. And there's a wide range of different areas. School absence, it was mentioned in our meeting this morning, that actually school absence doesn't mean been missing for huge periods of time.
we were talking earlier today, and they were talking about, young people who are being exploited between the time they were leaving school and they were getting home. In those 2 hours in between, that's where their exploitation was taking place. When they come to adults, they don't come and tell you that they've been sexually exploited. They don't come to you and tell you that. They come and tell you they've got stomach upset sometimes, they come to a doctor, they've got some problems with drugs and alcohol, and this is even more so for boys. Or some lethargy, just something they're not feeling very well. They don't really tell you what it's about. It is about the relationship and building that relationship. And I know that later on someone say you can develop it very quickly, and I actually agree with that. I haven't got time to do that. But if you're in the right place at the right time, you can actually develop it very quickly, which is a real challenge to us as professionals to say, actually, if we don't get out of the clinic and we don't be where young people are, then you're not going to help the most vulnerable young people. The outcomes in it also for them are very poor. Mental health outcomes for young people who've been sexually exploited. I deliberately used this one. This one mirrors the outcomes in Rotherham. Within the J report there are statistics on the outcomes for a lot of those young people, and you've got very similar depression, anxiety, all of these come out much the same. The difference with this is done by Dana Basson, who joined us last year, but she actually comes from Oakland, California. And these are statistics, research statistics in Oakland, in a community that's very different. The structure of that community contains largely African American, some Native American and Caucasian and some Oriental. It's a very different community, and yet the statistics when it comes around on sexual exploitation is in fact very similar, and the outcomes are very similar. So this is, as somebody said earlier, a global issue. It doesn't just exist in this country. The way the media, even at international level, present it, you present it as it's something that's happening in this country, and it's something to do around different cultures and clashes. But actually, you can see it in other parts of the world and very similar, and we know those things. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Roy. I'd like to thank Ray for that very insightful presentation. I think one of the main things we can take away from that is that not everyone is going to come and say, this has happened to me, I've been sexually abused or something, but they will develop other symptoms such as depression, anxiety, and I think that's a really, really good point to bring up. Just to sort of build upon that, we've got someone else from the National Working Group as well. We've got Bina Palmer, who's going to be discussing it from a victim's perspective. So if I can invite Bina up.
Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. Before I start, I just want to give you a quick overview. I've been working in this field for a few years now, and what I see is I hear a lot of stories, and I see professionals working with the young people. And for me, I hear far too many stories about young people being let down. They're being failed, they're not being listened to, they're being judged. Professionals are closing doors on these young people because they don't understand the issue, and when the issues do come to light, they don't know what to do with the issues. And we need to change that, and only working together can we do that. So it's really important that we need to think about that wider community approach to protecting these young people. And it's happening far too often. And Ray mentioned consent. And these young people cannot consent to their own abuse. Legally, young people cannot consent to their own sexual exploitation. And it's not an issue of consent. If you think about a young person who is being sexually exploited by a number of men, or a group of men and women, and in a lot of cases it is group and gang associated, and you think about a young person trying to say no to that abuse, what do you think some of those consequences might be to say no? Some of those consequences we know are things like violence, the threats against the family, threats to blow the house up, threats to rape the mother, threats to kill the grandmother. So we know that the consequences of saying no are very great. We know that in a particular case, young people were being branded with cigarettes. And most recently, we heard from a mother whose daughter had actually been killed, had been murdered by the abuser of her friend, of the young girl's friend, because she actually tried to stand up for her friend. She went to the police, she went to the social workers, and she tried to make professionals stand up and listen to what was happening to her friend. And for that, she was actually murdered by the abuser, and so was the younger sister. And the reason I'm telling you this is not to sensationalise the issue. I'm telling you this because this is the reality of what's happening to our the young people within our community. So we need to all stand up and try and work together. We can be the eyes and ears that can help professionals like the police and like the social workers and like health professionals. And when we all come together and we all bring that information into one pot, we can try and then build that bigger picture and try and protect our young people. Okay, so what do we actually know then about child sexual exploitation? The Office of the Children's Commissioner conducted a 2-year inquiry, and the report was published in November of last year. That inquiry found that there were 2,409 victims of child sexual exploitation and a further 16,500 young people who were identified as at risk of being a victim of child sexual exploitation. Now we know that this model, group and gang associated child sexual exploitation, is only one model. We live in a world now where social media is a very common form of communication. We all have mobile phones. We all use the internet, so online sexual exploitation is another model, and these figures don't include that particular model. We've got peer-on-peer abuse as well. If you think about, somebody mentioned Jimmy Saville earlier, and you know, that's another model. It's professionals or famous people using their power, using their position with an authority to abuse that position and exploit vulnerable young people. And in that particular case, we need to think about that institutional silence. For me, there is too often an institutional silence within the community and within particular groups, and we need to stand out and speak up about what's happening to these young people. We also know that we talk about group and gang associated child sexual exploitation, and we've just recently been made aware of a particular case where a 56-year-old male was a ringleader of a particular group. And it was, they were seen as an Asian group exploiting vulnerable white young girls. And I think that is a perception that we need to tackle. It's not just vulnerable young girls, vulnerable white girls that are being sexually exploited. There are groups of young people that are being exploited from other communities. And in this particular case, he couldn't actually be named for legal reasons because there was an ongoing investigation. And the ongoing investigation was around the exploitation of a vulnerable Asian girl from his own community who he was exploiting. So we need to think about tackling some of these misperceptions that we have. So some of the barriers to identification then. We know that young people find it very difficult to seek support, to identify what is happening to them, to talk to somebody and get the support that they need. And the barriers exist for the majority of victims of child sexual exploitation. Some of those reasons might be around fear of not being believed, fear of being isolated, the consequences of saying no, so the fear of violence from the perpetrators, the fact that they might have to go to court, so they might be fearful of the court process, because we know young people aggressively cross-examined during the court process. So there are all sorts of different reasons, but for particular groups there are further barriers for identification. So the Muslim Women's Network conducted a piece of research called Unheard Voices, and the report was published last year. And they found that some of the common reasons for not reporting in their studies was around the young girls from the BME community, and so their reasons were blackmail connected to shame and dishonour, so they didn't want to bring shame or dishonour to their families or to their communities. Emotional attachment, and some of these reasons will be relevant for all victims of child sexual exploitation. But emotional attachment to the perpetrators, dependency on drugs and alcohol, and again that will be true of all victims of child sexual exploitation. Fear of violence, fear of threats against the family or the friends, not being believed, and in this particular case it was not being believed by the families. And we know that these girls, even when the families do believe them, they then try and contain that because they don't want to go out into the communities, and not believe in themselves that they're actually victims. There are also barriers for boys and young men. So we know that the victims of child sexual exploitation are not just girls. Boys and young men are targeted, they're just as vulnerable, and they are being exploited, but we just don't know about it as much because it's not reported. And we know that boys and young men are less likely to seek support and disclose their offences. And again, there's reasons for that. And some of those are around discriminatory social attitudes and stereotypes. So fear of being seen as homosexual, stereotypes around masculinity, expectations that men have to be masculine, they have to be strong, they should be able to protect themselves. But actually, if we think about the control that these men or women exert on these vulnerable young people, the controls are psychological as well as physical and sexual controls as well. So we need to think about some of the reasons that boys and young men won't disclose, and we need to be able to identify those signs and symptoms. So we need to be working together, and this is just a list of some of the people that you might want to include in that partnership approach. We all have a duty of care to protect the young people within our community. I don't have children myself, but I'm passionate and I care and I want to look after young people within our community. And we all have different roles and responsibilities to play in that response to child sexual exploitation. And some of the people that we could include in that would be licensing, because they will have different powers to what the police might have. We need to think about councillors and MPs to try and lobby for some support at that level as well. We can think about the media, and I know that we do have some media here today, but we need to think about engaging the media so we can get the right messages out there, so that we can build public confidence in the work that we're actually doing. So we identified that there was a particular issue, and the national government identified the particular issue as well. So in 2009, government published some guidance, and that guidance actually says that sexual exploitation is not limited to particular geographical areas, and all safeguarding children's boards should assume that it is an issue in their area. And I think it's safe to say we all need to assume that it's happening on our doorsteps. The Home Office recently launched their Modern Slavery campaign. And that campaign said that in 2013, 1% of forced labour victims referred to services came from the restaurant or bar sector, and 41% of victims were trafficked for sexual exploitation, with 44 people sexually exploited in hotels. So we know that this happens in various different locations. It happens in hotels, it happens in parks, it happens in shisha bars, it happens in leisure centres. We know that historically it's happened in public toilets where boys specifically were being sexually exploited. So we need to be tackling these different locations. We know that the numbers coming to light are small, but that's due to the hidden nature of this crime, and we know that the numbers are actually higher. And I've already talked about some of the reasons why it's such a hidden crime is because the young people are not being identified. That's because they're scared to talk about what's happening to them, but also professionals haven't had the training or the education or the awareness for them to actually be able to identify and respond appropriately. It's one thing identifying and knowing it's happening, but then what do you do with it? How do you then support those young people, and how do you then prosecute the offenders? So this is a CCTV image of a man who is a perpetrator taking two young girls into a hotel, and we know that the young girl at the front was actually raped in the hotel. Now, had this hotel, had the receptionist had training or awareness around this particular issue, would the outcome have been different? Would that young person have actually been raped in that hotel? We don't know for certain whether that would have actually happened. But what I can say is that there is training and awareness taking place in hotels, and it is having a positive impact. So we've been working on a national campaign which is called Say Something If You See Something. It's a national campaign originally targeting hotels and B&Bs, but we've extended it to include the leisure, retail, transport industries, and actually we want to get it out there wider, so we want to get into those sports clubs, and we will be having conversations with Boxing England. We want to get into all the different types of sports clubs, because actually these are the places that young people will go. They choose to go there because for them those are the safe places, so we need to get in there, and we need to raise awareness through the posters and the leaflets and the training programmes that are contained within this campaign, which was launched and has in Westminster, so has been supported and endorsed at a national level. And I just want to finish by saying that there are clearly parallels here to domestic abuse, and I think we are where we were with domestic abuse probably about 13, 14 years ago. There are parallels, and we think about young people who keep going back. So professionals say, why do they keep going back then? If they've been raped, why do they keep going back? Well, because they're being controlled and they're being manipulated, and these perpetrators are very controlling, very manipulative and very clever, and they do make threats to kill. So we need to think about the parallels to domestic abuse and how have we tackled that issue. We need to think about that Stockholm syndrome as well. And we also need to think about the language, because we know that unfortunately young people are labelled as prostitutes. They're seen as consenting, they're seen as asking for it, but we need to think about the language, because these are victims of a horrendous crime, and we need to remember that. And we need to make services accessible as well. So it's one thing having a project in the centre of town, but is that accessible for young people? We need to think about these so-called hard-to-reach communities. Are they hard to reach because we don't know how to engage with them? If we know how to engage with them, we will. It's about having that conversation, and we don't need to refer to them as hard-to-reach communities, because if we have that conversation, if we build that relationship, we have that dialogue, we can get into those communities and try and help them. And I just want to leave you with one quote, which is, if you can't rule it out, rule it in. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Bina, for that fantastic presentation. I think it's given us a real insight into what can sort of take place through a victim's mind.